History often unfolds not in sudden bursts but in long, gradual currents, shaped by the interplay of individuals, institutions, and societies, and the story of Adolf Hitler is one of the most studied examples of how a single life, beginning in obscurity, can intersect with vast historical forces to produce consequences that reverberate across continents and generations. To understand this trajectory, one must begin not with the dictator of the 1930s and 1940s, but with the child born in a provincial town along the Inn River in 1889, a child whose upbringing was marked by the rhythms of bureaucracy, Catholic tradition, and the modest routines of provincial life, and whose later years would be spent wandering through cities, absorbing ideas, and struggling with rejection before finding a path into politics. The following narrative, divided into long, flowing sections, traces this journey from birth to the aftermath of war, situating Hitler's life within the broader cultural, social, and political contexts of Europe, and showing how the ordinary landscapes of towns, schools, and cafes gradually gave way to the extraordinary upheavals of dictatorship, war, and destruction. On the quiet morning of April 20, 1889, in the small border town of Braunau am Inn, situated along the Inn River where Austria meets Germany, Adolf Hitler was born into a modest apartment above a customs office, in a region where the rhythms of life were steady and shaped by imperial administration, Catholic tradition, and the slow commerce that moved along waterways and country roads, his father Alois Hitler serving as a mid-ranking customs official in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, accustomed to uniforms, regulations, and the hierarchical structure of state service, while his mother Clara managed the household with quiet dedication, raising her children in an environment that combined discipline with maternal care, and the family moved frequently during Adolf's childhood, living in towns such as Passau, Lambach, Landing, and eventually Linz, each relocation reflecting the practical demands of Alois' career and each leaving the young boy to adapt once more to new schools, new teachers, and new surroundings. And in Linz, a city along the Danube with Baroque churches and administrative buildings, Adolf attended school with uneven results, sometimes performing adequately, sometimes resisting authority, while gradually developing a preference for drawing and architecture rather than formal academic study. And after Alois died in 1903, the structure of paternal authority weakened, and when Clara died in December 1907 after a prolonged illness, Adolf, then 18 years old, found himself with limited direction and a modest inheritance, traveling to Vienna that same year hoping to gain admission to the Academy of Fine Arts, yet rejected in both 1907 and 1908, examiners noting deficiencies in his ability to depict the human figure. And Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century was a vast imperial capital, home to nearly 2 million people, representing diverse ethnicities and languages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, filled with cafes where newspapers were read and political discussions unfolded daily. And during the years from 1908 to 1913, Hitler lived in men's hostels and small rented rooms, earning a limited income by painting watercolor scenes of Vienna's buildings and selling them to merchants or tourists, his days often passing quietly, spent reading newspapers, observing public life, and reflecting on political ideas that were widely circulated at the time, including German nationalism, racial theories, and resentment toward perceived political adversaries. And in this environment his worldview took shape gradually, shaped not by official power but by personal interpretation of the social and political currents around him. And though he failed to enter the academy, the years in Vienna exposed him to the cultural grandeur of the Ringstrasse, the debates of the coffeehouses, the tensions of a multi-ethnic empire, and the growing currents of nationalism and antisemitism that would later become central to his ideology, leaving him both embittered by rejection and fascinated by the idea of strong leadership and cultural unity. In 1913, Adolf Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich, a city that for him represented both escape and aspiration, for he sought to avoid conscription into the Austro-Hungarian army and instead align himself with Germany. which he admired as the cultural and political embodiment of the ideals he had absorbed during his years of reading and reflection. And Munich itself was a vibrant city of art, music, and intellectual ferment, with galleries, theaters, and beer halls where politics and culture intertwined. And when the First World War erupted in August 1914, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army and was accepted despite his Austrian citizenship, a decision that would define the next 4 years of his life. And he served primarily as a dispatch runner, a role that required him to carry messages across dangerous terrain, often under fire, traversing landscapes scarred by shell craters, mud, and barbed wire. And the war was a mixture of monotony and terror, with long stretches of waiting in trenches punctuated by sudden artillery bombardments and assaults. And Hitler experienced both the camaraderie of soldiers and the brutal realities of industrial warfare, being wounded in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme and later temporarily blinded by a gas attack in October 1918. And while recovering in a hospital in Passau, he learned of Germany's request for an armistice and the subsequent collapse of the monarchy, with Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicating and the Weimar Republic proclaimed. And for Hitler this moment was devastating, reinforcing feelings of betrayal and humiliation. And the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations payments, contributing to economic strain and political polarization in Germany. And in the immediate post-war years, Hitler remained in Munich, a city marked by unrest, revolution, and counter-revolution, where soldiers, workers, and political activists clashed in the streets. And he worked briefly for the German army as an informant assigned to observe political organizations, attending meetings and reporting on their activities. And in September 1919 he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, a small nationalist group, and soon joined, finding that his ability to speak in public attracted attention, and his speeches, filled with passion and resentment, drew audiences who were disillusioned by defeat and economic hardship. And by 1920 the party had been renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, adopting a program that combined nationalism, opposition to the Versailles Treaty, anti-Marxism, and racial ideology. And meetings were held in beer halls filled with smoke, noise, and fervent discussion, where economic hardship and political instability provided fertile ground for nationalist rhetoric. And Hitler's oratory skills transformed him from a marginal figure into a rising leader. And in November 1923, during a period of hyperinflation when the German currency had lost much of its value and savings were eroded, the party attempted to seize power in Munich in the beer hall putsch, but the attempt failed, and Hitler was arrested and tried for treason. And during his imprisonment in Landsberg in 1924 he dictated much of what became Mein Kampf, outlining his ideological vision, including territorial expansion in Eastern Europe, the subordination of individuals to the state, and the concept of centralized leadership. And though the coup had failed, the trial and imprisonment gave him national attention. And upon his release in December 1924 he reorganized the party to pursue power legally, building a structured organization with regional branches, youth movements, and paramilitary formations such as the SA. And thus the years from Munich to Landsberg marked the transformation of Hitler from a failed artist and soldier into a political figure whose ambitions were now tied to the destiny of Germany itself. And the post-war years, filled with economic collapse, political violence, and social dislocation, provided a stage upon which his rhetoric could resonate, turning personal bitterness into collective mobilization. And in this crucible of defeat and instability, the seeds of dictatorship were sown, nourished by resentment, sharpened by ambition, and carried forward by the force of words spoken in crowded halls where despair saw direction. The years following Hitler's release from Landsberg prison in December 1924 marked a decisive turning point, for he recognized that the failed beer hall putsch had demonstrated the limits of violent insurrection and that the path to power would require patience, organization, and the exploitation of legal and electoral mechanisms. And thus he set about rebuilding the National Socialist German Workers' Party with a new emphasis on structure, discipline, and outreach, establishing regional branches across Germany, cultivating youth movements to attract the next generation, and strengthening paramilitary formations such as the Sturmstuhl SA, whose brown-shirted members patrolled the streets, intimidated opponents, and gave the movement a visible presence. And during the mid-1920s, Germany experienced a period of relative stabilization under the Weimar Republic, aided by foreign loans and diplomatic agreements such as the Das Plan. And this stabilization temporarily slowed the growth of extremist movements. Yet Hitler used the time to refine his rhetoric, expand his network, and cultivate loyalty among followers, and his speeches, delivered in beer halls and public gatherings, combined fiery denunciations of the Treaty of Versailles with promises of national revival. And though the party remained marginal in electoral terms during these years, it developed a core of dedicated supporters who saw in Hitler a leader capable of articulating their frustrations. And then came the global economic crisis of 1929, triggered by the Wall Street crash, which sent shockwaves across Europe, collapsing banks, shuttering businesses, and driving unemployment to unprecedented levels. And in Germany, millions found themselves without work, savings evaporated, and the fragile political coalitions of the Weimar Republic began to fracture. And it was in this environment of despair and disillusionment that the Nazi Party's message gained traction, presenting itself as a movement of renewal, strength, and unity, promising jobs, stability, and the restoration of national pride. And the party's electoral fortunes rose sharply, with rallies drawing thousands, propaganda posters filling the streets, and the image of Hitler carefully cultivated as a man of destiny. And Joseph Goebbels, the party's propaganda chief, orchestrated campaigns that blended modern techniques with emotional appeals, using radio, film, and mass rallies to create a sense of belonging and purpose. And the SAS presence in the streets gave the party both visibility and intimidation power, clashing with communists and social democrats in violent confrontations that reinforced the image of politics as struggle. And by July 1930, the Nazi Party had become the largest party in the Reichstag, though without an absolute majority. And political negotiations among conservative leaders, who believed they could harness Hitler's popularity while controlling him within a coalition government, ultimately led to President Paul von Hindenburg appointing him Chancellor on January 30, 1933, a decision that would prove fateful. For within weeks the Reichstag fire in February 1933 was used to justify emergency decrees restricting civil liberties, and in March the Enabling Act granted the government authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval, effectively dismantling parliamentary democracy, and opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and regional governments brought under central control in a process known as Gleichschaltung. And economic policies emphasized public works, including the construction of highways known as Autobahnen, alongside expanded rearmament programs, reducing unemployment while preparing for military growth. And propaganda became integrated into daily life through radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, and orchestrated public gatherings. And in June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives eliminated rivals within the party, consolidating Hitler's authority. And after Hindenburg's death in August 1934, the offices of President and Chancellor were merged, and Hitler assumed the title of Führer, cementing his dictatorship. And the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 redefined citizenship along racial lines, stripping Jewish citizens of rights and reshaping social relations throughout Germany. And thus the years from 1924 to 1935 marked the extraordinary ascent of Hitler from a failed coup leader to the absolute ruler of Germany, a trajectory made possible by economic collapse, political miscalculation, and the resonance of nationalist rhetoric in a society searching for stability. And the transformation of the Nazi Party from a fringe movement into a mass organization reflected not only Hitler's personal ambition but also the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions under strain, vulnerabilities that were exploited through a combination of legal maneuvering, propaganda, intimidation, and the promise of national revival. And by the mid-1990s, Germany had been reshaped into a totalitarian state, its institutions aligned under the principle of Führer authority, its economy directed toward rearmament, and its society increasingly defined by exclusion, conformity, and mobilization, setting the stage for the aggressive foreign policy and catastrophic war that would follow. And in this period, the seeds of global conflict were already being sown. For Hitler's consolidation of power was not merely a domestic transformation but the preparation for a confrontation with the world order established after 1919, a confrontation that would soon engulf Europe in flames. And the rise of the Nazi Party during these years was not simply the story of one man's ambition but the story of a nation grappling with defeat, humiliation, and economic despair. A nation that turned to radical solutions and charismatic leadership, and in doing so opened the door to dictatorship, war, and genocide. And thus the ascent of Hitler in the late 1920s and early 1930s stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential shifts in modern history, a reminder of how fragile democratic institutions can be when confronted with crisis, and how quickly a society can be transformed when fear, anger, and hope are harnessed by a movement promising renewal at any cost. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had transformed Germany into a totalitarian state, its institutions aligned under the principle of Führer authority, its economy directed toward rearmament, and its society increasingly defined by exclusion, conformity, and mobilization. And this consolidation of power was reinforced through propaganda, surveillance, and the suppression of dissent, with the Gestapo monitoring citizens, concentration camps housing political opponents, and the press reduced to instruments of state messaging. And the Nazi regime sought not only to control politics but to reshape culture, education, and daily life, with schools indoctrinating youth, organizations such as the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls fostering loyalty from childhood, and art, literature, and film subjected to censorship and ideological guidance, and the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 institutionalized racial discrimination, stripping Jews of citizenship and rights, while propaganda campaigns portrayed them as outsiders and enemies, laying the groundwork for more radical policies to come. And foreign policy during this period was driven by the desire to revise the post-war settlement imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, with Germany reintroducing conscription in 1935, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, and strengthening alliances with Italy and Japan. And these moves tested the resolve of Britain and France, who responded with caution and appeasement, hoping to avoid another devastating war. And in March 1938, Austria was annexed in the Anschluss, greeted by many with enthusiasm but also enforced through intimidation. And later that year, Germany acquired the Sudetenland following the Munich Agreement, a moment often remembered as the height of appeasement, when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared peace for our time, though the agreement only emboldened Hitler further. And in March 1939, German forces occupied a remainder of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that his ambitions extended beyond the revision of Versailles to outright territorial expansion. And diplomatic tensions escalated as Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939. A non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. And on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, unleashing blitzkrieg tactics that combined rapid armored assaults, air strikes, and coordinated infantry movements, overwhelming Polish defenses, and Britain and France declared war 2 days later, marking the beginning of the Second World War. And early campaigns in Poland and Western Europe brought rapid territorial expansion, with Denmark and Norway falling in 1940, followed by the swift defeat of France, and much of continental Europe was under German control or influence, and administrative systems were established in occupied territories to manage resources, enforce policies, and coordinate economic extraction, while propaganda portrayed these victories as evidence of German strength and destiny. And yet beneath the triumphs lay the seeds of catastrophe. for the regime's racial ideology was increasingly translated into policy, with Jews and other groups targeted for exclusion, persecution, and eventual annihilation, and the road to war was thus not only a story of diplomatic maneuvers and military campaigns but also of ideological radicalization, the fusion of expansionist ambition with racial hatred, and the transformation of Germany into a state prepared to wage total war. And by 1939 the world stood on the brink of a conflict that would engulf continents, reshape societies, and leave legacies that endure to this day. And the consolidation of power at home, combined with the aggressive pursuit of territory abroad, marked the culmination of Hitler's rise, a trajectory that had begun in the beer halls of Munich and now threatened the stability of the entire international order. And the outbreak of war was the inevitable consequence of a regime that defined itself through struggle, expansion, and the rejection of compromise, a regime that saw peace not as an end but as a temporary pause before the next confrontation. And thus the years from 1933 to 1939 represent the transformation of Germany from a fragile democracy into a militarized dictatorship poised to plunge the world into unprecedented destruction. And this transformation was not sudden but gradual, built step by step through laws, decrees, propaganda, and intimidation, each measure tightening the grip of the regime, each success emboldening its ambitions, and each concession by foreign powers reinforcing the belief that Germany could act without consequence. And so the march toward war was not only the product of Hitler's will but also of the failures of others to resist, the miscalculations of leaders who underestimated him, and the willingness of societies to embrace promises of revival even at the cost of freedom. And in this way the consolidation of power and the expansionist policies of the 1930s were inseparable, two sides of the same process, one domestic, the other international, both leading inexorably to the conflagration that would soon engulf the world. The outbreak of war in September 1939 marked the beginning of a global conflict that would stretch across continents and reshape the 20th century. And Germany's invasion of Poland, executed with blitzkrieg tactics that combined rapid armored assaults, coordinated infantry movements, and devastating air strikes, overwhelmed Polish defenses and shocked the world with its speed and ferocity. And Britain and France declared war, yet within months Germany's forces expanded their reach, occupying Denmark and Norway in 1940, sweeping through the Low Countries, and defeating France in a campaign that stunned observers with its efficiency, leaving Britain to stand alone against the Axis powers. And the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 saw German aircraft bomb London and other cities in an attempt to force surrender, but the Royal Air Force resisted, and Hitler turned his attention eastward, launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which opened a vast eastern front stretching across forests, plains, and cities. And though initial advances were rapid, capturing large swaths of territory and encircling Soviet armies, the campaign soon bogged down in the face of fierce resistance, logistical challenges, and the brutal Russian winter. And as the war expanded, Nazi policies targeting Jews and other groups intensified into systematic deportations, ghettos, and mass killings, coordinated through administrative mechanisms that culminated in the Holocaust, with extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor becoming sites of industrialized murder. And millions of Jews, along with Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, were killed in a genocide that remains one of history's darkest chapters. And by 1942 the war had become truly global, with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor bringing the United States into the conflict, and the Allies coordinated strategies across multiple theaters, while Germany pressed on in the east, besieging Leningrad, advancing toward Moscow, and fighting in the Caucasus. Yet the tide began to turn with the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-1943, where Soviet forces encircled and destroyed the German Sixth Army, marking a decisive defeat. And in North Africa Allied forces pushed back German and Italian troops, eventually invading Italy in 1943. while sustained Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities, targeting industrial production and infrastructure, and civilians experienced rationing, air raids, and displacement, while industrial production was redirected towards sustaining the war effort. And in July 1944, a group of officers attempted to assassinate Hitler in the July 20 plot. But the attempt failed, resulting in further repression and purges, and by early 1945 Allied forces advanced from west and east, with American, British, and French troops crossing the Rhine while Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, and leadership operations were concentrated in the capital, where beneath the Reich Chancellery in an underground bunker final decisions were made amid reports of approaching Soviet forces, and on April 30, 1945 Adolf Hitler died there, ending his rule, and Germany surrendered unconditionally in early May 1945, and the war left cities in ruins, populations displaced, and Europe divided into occupation zones that later formed separate states in East and West Germany. And the Holocaust left a scar on humanity, its memory preserved through survivor testimony, trials such as Nuremberg, and memorials that sought to ensure that such atrocities would never be repeated. And the collapse of Germany was not only a military defeat but a moral reckoning, exposing the consequences of dictatorship, racial ideology, and total war. And the years from 1939 to 1945 thus represent both the height of Nazi power and its catastrophic downfall, a trajectory that began with triumphs and expansion but ended in destruction, genocide, and division. And the legacy of this period continues to shape global memory, international law, and the commitment to human rights, reminding future generations of the dangers of authoritarianism and the fragility of peace when confronted with ambition, hatred, and unchecked power. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked not only the end of the Second World War but the beginning of a new era defined by reconstruction, division, and remembrance. For the nation lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble by sustained Allied bombing campaigns, its infrastructure shattered, its population displaced, and its political institutions dismantled, and the Allies divided Germany into occupation zones, with the United States, Britain, and France administering the West and the Soviet Union controlling the East, and Berlin itself was partitioned, becoming a symbol of the larger geopolitical divide that would soon harden into the Cold War. And the Nuremberg trials held between 1945 and 1946 sought to bring leading figures of the Nazi regime to justice, establishing precedents for international law and the prosecution of crimes against humanity. And survivors of the Holocaust gave testimony that revealed the scale and horror of genocide, shaping collective memory and ensuring that the atrocities would not be forgotten. And in the years that followed, West Germany embarked on reconstruction aided by the Marshall Plan, rebuilding its economy and integrating into Western alliances such as NATO and the European Coal and Steel Community, while East Germany became a socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union, its society shaped by central planning, surveillance, and ideological conformity. And the Berlin Wall erected in 1961 came to embody the division of Europe, separating families and communities while symbolizing the confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism. And yet amid the geopolitical struggles, Germany also confronted its past, with memorials, museums, and education programs dedicated to preserving the memory of the Holocaust and teaching future generations about the dangers of dictatorship and intolerance. And the legacy of Hitler's regime reverberated far beyond Germany, influencing the creation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international institutions designed to prevent future global conflicts. And scholars debated the nature of totalitarianism, the psychology of leadership, and the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions, while survivors and descendants carried memories into literature, testimony, and art. and the world continued to wrestle with the lessons of that era. And as decades passed, Germany transformed from a divided nation into a reunified state after 1990, its capital restored to Berlin, its society committed to democracy, and its role in Europe redefined as a leader in integration and cooperation. And yet the shadow of the past remained, a reminder of how ordinary institutions can be corrupted, how ordinary citizens can be mobilized for extraordinary crimes, and how vigilance is required to preserve freedom. And thus the aftermath of Hitler's rule was not only a story of destruction and division but also of renewal, reflection, and responsibility, a story that continues to shape the modern world, reminding us that history is not merely memory but a guide, warning against complacency and urging the defense of human dignity against the forces of hatred and tyranny. In the decades following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the nation's trajectory was shaped not only by the devastation of war but by the geopolitical realities of the emerging Cold War. For the division of Germany into occupation zones hardened into the creation of two separate states, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, established in 1949 under the influence of the United States, Britain, and France, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, formed under Soviet control. And this division reflected the broader confrontation between capitalist democracy and communist authoritarianism, with each side seeking to rebuild society according to its ideological vision. And in West Germany, reconstruction was aided by the Marshall Plan, which provided financial assistance to rebuild infrastructure, industry, and housing, and the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, of the 1950s and 1960s transformed the Western state into a prosperous society, integrating it into NATO and the European Economic Community, while East Germany pursued central planning, collectivization, and alignment with the Warsaw Pact, its economy slower to recover, its society marked by surveillance through the Stasi, and its citizens restricted in travel and expression, and Berlin itself became the focal point of Cold War tensions, divided into sectors and eventually split by the Berlin Wall in 1961, a concrete barrier that separated families, communities, and ideologies, symbolizing the confrontation between East and West. And yet despite the division, both German states developed distinct identities, with West Germany embracing democracy, consumer culture, and integration into Western Europe, while East Germany emphasized socialist solidarity, industrial production, and loyalty to the Soviet bloc. And the Cold War years were punctuated by crises, protests, and cultural exchanges, with the Berlin Wall serving as both a physical and symbolic reminder of the global struggle. And as decades passed, the memory of Hitler's regime remained central to German identity, with West Germany confronting its past through trials, memorials, and education, while East Germany framed anti-fascism as a foundational principle, though often avoiding deeper reflection on complicity. And the division of Germany persisted until the late 1980s, when political changes in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, combined with growing protests in East Germany, eroded the foundations of the communist regime. And in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell, a moment of celebration and transformation, as citizens crossed freely between East and West, embracing reunification. And in 1990 Germany was formally reunified, its capital restored to Berlin, its institutions merged, and its society committed to democracy and integration within Europe. And the reunification process was complex, involving economic disparities, cultural differences, and political adjustments, yet it marked the culmination of decades of division, and Germany emerged as a central actor in the European Union, a nation that had moved from dictatorship to division to democracy, carrying with it the lessons of its past. And the Cold War era thus represents not only the confrontation between superpowers but also the transformation of Germany from a defeated and divided state into a reunified democracy, a journey that underscores the resilience of societies, the importance of memory, and the enduring impact of history on the present. The story of Adolf Hitler does not end with his death in 1945, nor even with the collapse of the Nazi regime, but continues in the long shadow cast over Germany and the world in the decades that follow. The division of Germany into East and West, described in the 7th paragraph, was itself a consequence of the destruction he unleashed, for the Cold War map of Europe was drawn upon the ruins of his ambitions. The Berlin Wall, the confrontation of ideologies, and the eventual reunification in 1990 all unfolded against the backdrop of a past that demanded constant reckoning. Hitler's legacy was not only the devastation of war and genocide but also the burden of memory, a burden that shaped German identity, politics, and culture long after the guns fell silent. The reunified Germany of the late 20th century carried with it both the scars of division and the responsibility of remembrance, ensuring that the lessons of dictatorship, intolerance, and unchecked power would be taught to future generations. Thus, the closure of Hitler's story is inseparable from the rebirth of Germany, a nation that rose from ruins, endured division, and ultimately chose democracy and integration, standing as a living reminder that history's darkest chapters must be remembered not to glorify them, but to guard against their return. In this way, the end of Hitler is not only the end of a man but the beginning of a long, ongoing dialogue between past and present, a dialogue that continues to shape the world we live in today. And so, we close the chapter on this long and heavy story. From beginnings through war and division, to the lessons carried forward, history reminds us of both the darkness humanity can fall into and the resilience with which it can rise again. For tonight, let these echoes of the past fade quietly into the background, becoming just another story among many. May the weight of history drift away as you rest, and may the silence of the night bring you peace. Good night.